Hello, Level 2. Welcome to your Week 3 lesson. So a couple of housekeeping things before we start. If you go to your Hapara workspace, you will find the PowerPoint that I've used in this lesson just here for you in this column here. So that's one thing to think about. The other thing is that if you scroll down just one more thing, you'll find a really helpful summary of all the different perspectives here. So some really useful information there for you. So I suggest that you have a look at that. And finally, if you're struggling, if you're finding this really tough, go to the purple one here and you will find an alternative assessment task. So an easier assessment task if you're aiming for a grade of achieved and merit. So instead of having to write the court transcript and worry about different people and asking them hard questions, you might find it more straightforward to have a go at filling in this grid in as much detail as possible. You can see I've actually put some information in there to help you as well. So that's an option if it's just proving to be too difficult. Okay, on to today's lesson, which is all about your closing speech, and it's also got some tips that will help you writing some quite hard questions for the people that you've cross-examined. So you might want to go back after this and add in some extra questions and some extra evidence that will just improve your grade a little bit. All right, for your closing speech, this is what you have to do. Firstly, you need to, so the closing speech is you at the end, you've cross-examined all your people, and now you're summing up for the judge. Now, the first thing to do is summarize the perspectives of the people you cross-examined. So just a sentence for each. So you need to say, Mrs. Nakamura says this, and then Truman believes this, and then finally, Gar Alperovitz, if you have him in your screenplay, you might not, Gar Alperovitz has this. So that's the first thing you need to do. Then you need to make and explain your overall judgment. So you need to tell the judge whether you believe that Truman is guilty or not guilty. Now, it's completely up to you. You decide. When I originally planned this, I was thinking that everyone would find Truman guilty, but now I'm not so sure, so it's up to you. Then, if you have decided that Truman's guilty, then you need to come up with a sentence or a punishment for Truman. And you can have some fun here. I mean, bearing in mind you've brought him back from the dead, it really is up to you, really. If you are going for high merit or excellence, then there's a couple of tips here for you. You might also want to talk about what if this had happened, what if that had happened, would things have ended differently? And also you might like to mention that the consequences of dropping the bomb, which were basically the Cold War and the nuclear arms race, were caused by the dropping of the atomic bomb. And you can find that information on pages 49 to 50 of your background booklet. So that's what. Okay, moving on. So there are some important things to think about when you're writing. And you might like to ask Truman, Alperovitz, or Mrs. Nakamura some of these questions when you cross-examine them. So they might help you a bit. Okay, big question number one is how many lives were saved by the dropping of the bomb? So this is really controversial. Now, you would have read in Stimson's article, because Stimson said that if the bomb hadn't been dropped and if the US had had to invade Japan instead, it would have cost over 1 million casualties, over 1 million US lives. Now, no one is quite sure where he got that figure from or how it was worked out. Now, Harry Truman gave lots of different figures over the different years. He said 250,000 lives, he said 500,000 casualties, he said 125,000 lives. So the point is that no one's exactly sure. So really, it's most likely that Stimson or Truman didn't actually know. They didn't have an exact figure when they were doing the decision making, and that they might have been guessing, or later on after the bomb was dropped, when they were trying to justify their decision, they might even have been exaggerating. But what we do know, without a doubt, that even without an invasion, in the 3 months before Hiroshima, every day the US was losing lives in the Pacific War, and every month they were losing 9,700 soldiers. So as far as Truman was concerned, dropping the bomb would end the war and stop the killing, and that was what he wanted, really. Now, this is an important question. Would it have been possible to avoid invading Japan without using the bomb? Because Stimson's argument is basically we dropped the bomb, so we didn't have to invade Japan. And that sounds quite straightforward, right? But what we know now is that the war would have probably ended before it was necessary to invade Japan. And this was because the Japanese were actually in quite a bad state. The US was about to bomb the railways, while the food was distributed by rail. The Japanese were facing starvation anyway, and because of this and destruction of cities, the Japanese had really low morale, and they were basically asking the government to surrender. Now, the emperor, remember, after the bomb was dropped, he went to the US and he said, look, can we change the terms and can you let me keep my throne, sort of thing. Now, it's very likely that he would have done that before a Japanese invasion, because of the high cost of lives, the destruction that would have been done by the US Navy and the US Air Force, and the fact that Hirohito could not afford to lose the love of the people. And he could have asked to have his position saved under a surrender. So what we're thinking now, with the benefit of hindsight, is that an invasion probably didn't need to occur. Now, Stimson and Truman didn't know that, of course, when they were making the decision. Now, after the war, high-ranking members of the US forces said exactly that. They said that by bombing Japan and by having a naval blockade on Japan, Japan would have been forced to surrender even without the dropping of the bomb. So they're basically saying, look, the war would have been over before we dropped the bomb anyway. We've got no evidence that Truman or Stimson knew this before the bomb was dropped. No one knew how weak Japan had been until after they had surrendered. There you go. Now, would Japan have surrendered earlier if the Potsdam Declaration had promised to leave the emperor on his throne? So the Potsdam Declaration, remember, was when Japan were basically warned and given a chance to surrender, and they ignored that chance to surrender. Now, Alperovitz and his revisionist friends, their argument is that Japan definitely would have surrendered earlier if the Potsdam Declaration had said, look, Japan, surrender, but we'll look after Hirohito, don't worry. Now, we're not sure whether that's true because the decision makers in the Japanese army and parliament, they were in deadlock. So the politicians wanted to surrender, but the army refused. We haven't got any proof that this would have happened. And Hirohito, even though he wasn't offered, surrender with his throne, he could have asked for it at any point because he did after the bomb was dropped. So what most historians are now thinking is that it really didn't have much to do with the Potsdam Declaration not having a chance to save Hirohito. What they're kind of thinking now is that it was the double shock of the bomb and the Soviet invasion of Manchuria, which was Japanese territory, that actually forced Hirohito to decide to surrender. So we're kind of thinking now that it really wasn't to do with Hirohito's position because he could have asked for that at any point. So that's interesting. All right. Did the US drop the bomb in order to intimidate Russia? Because that's what Gar Alperovitz says, remember? That's his argument. And yes, the US definitely dropped the bomb to intimidate Russia, but it wasn't the major reason. It was a minor reason. It was a factor. I mean, it certainly counted, but it wasn't the biggest thing. Now, there was a bit of a problem with the US and the Soviet Union. This is Europe after World War II. This is Europe after the Allies and the Soviet Union had defeated Hitler. Now, everything red is basically territory taken by the Soviet Union whilst they were defeating Hitler. And you see all those red Eastern European countries, East Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria. That was all territory that basically the Soviet Union wasn't giving back in Europe. So the US already knew that they had a problem with the Soviet Union being very powerful and quite kind of territory hungry. Now, this is the Pacific in August 1945. Now, everything blue is what territory Japan had left by 1945. Anything dark red was Allied territory, but all the pinks and light reds are territory that the Allies had taken back from the Japanese, territory that basically the US had been fighting very hard all the way across the Pacific here to take back. Now, look at this great big blue lump above Japan. This is Japan here. Look at this blue stuff here. That's Manchuria. Now, up here is the Soviet Union. Now, the US knew that the Soviet Union had its eye on Manchuria, and the Soviet Union could enter the war, say it was helping the US, and then when Japan surrendered, take a great big chunk of it. And the US was really concerned about that. They were worried about that, and they were worried about the Soviet Union being too powerful. So by dropping a great big atomic bomb, was basically saying to the US, hey, basically saying to the Soviet Union, hey, we've got a great big bomb, don't mess with us. So this is what historians today believe that what the major motives were for the US decision to drop the bomb. Now, number one was absolutely, definitely ending the war as soon as possible. That was what Truman and Stimson and all the decision makers in the US wanted to do. They wanted the war finished. Now, the ones in blue, they are motives, they are reasons, but they are kind of less important reasons. So the second reason was justifying the cost of the Manhattan Project. It had cost $2 million to build those bombs. And it would have been very difficult for Truman to say to the post-war US public, hey, look, I spent $2 million on developing an atomic bomb, but yeah, I didn't use it. No, we just carried on using our traditional weapons. And by the way, that cost thousands of more American lives, sorry. Another reason was definitely to impress the Soviets, to kind of show the Soviet Union that the US was powerful, so they could have kind of do better negotiations with them in post-war Asia. Number four was there wasn't really any reasons not to drop the bomb. If in war you develop an amazing weapon and it costs you millions, you're going to use it. It's kind of hard to say, well, we had this great big gun, but we decided not to use it. And finally, the Americans sincerely believed that they were dealing with a beast. They felt that the bombing of Pearl Harbor had been a very aggressive and unjustified tactic without a proper declaration of war. They felt that Japanese war crimes were terrible. They, the US soldiers struggled with kamikaze pilots, the Japanese tradition of fighting to the absolute death, even if you knew you're going to lose. The US really felt they were dealing with a race that was very different to their own and were morally wrong. And they were a beast. And there's a good quote a bit later on that will help you with that. So I hope that those kind of discussions and those questions have helped you a little bit in finishing off your perspectives. And there's some hard questions there that you can be asking. You can be asking the people that you cross-examine. On these last few slides here, I've just put some quotes that might be useful. You don't have to use these, but you might just like to read through them. They might be quite interesting for you, especially if you're going for excellence. So they're just there to help you. Okay, good luck. And please, please, please email me when you're ready for me to look at your work, and email me if you need any help. And I will see you in Friday's Zoom lesson. Well done. Good stuff.